Hi guys, welcome to another booktube video from me, Amy. Today I'm going to be doing my wrap up of the best books I've read so far in the first half of 2018. I have 10 books chosen to talk about today, so I'm just going to jump right on in. Oh, and I got my hair cut. Feels pretty fresh. Please don't mind my dog here being lazy. Dawny, you're so funny. So this is not going to be in any particular order. I'm just going to read them out as they are stacked here, which is pretty randomly. First up, I have The Spare Room by Helen Garner, one of the only Helen Garner books I hadn't read yet. So at the moment I'm trying to plow through the few books I have left of Helen Garner's to read so that I can do my Helen Garner, Where to Start with Helen Garner video, which I've been really looking forward to doing on BookTube. This book is a masterpiece in my opinion. This is a brilliant short novel. Helen writes, when she writes her fiction, she always writes herself into the stories, or pretty much most of the time, and they're usually told from her perspective, which I completely understand because when I'm writing I do the same thing. So in this story her name is Helen, but it's non-fiction, but it's fiction, so it's not necessarily true. And she has a friend come to stay with her who is sick, and it's the story of going through this life-altering experience, and it's really about the trials and tribulations of friendship. I feel like today probably wasn't a good day to film because I can't think about what I'm saying at all. But yes, this was a 5-star read for me. It was a very quick read. I read it when I was at my parents' house staying in their spare room, funnily enough, and yeah, it's one of the best standout fiction reads for me this year. So it's Helen Garner, The Spare Room. Next up we have another Helen Garner. This is her probably most renowned fiction, Monkey Grip. It was published in the 80s. It's a story of drug addiction and love relationships. She seems to fall for this man who is just treating her terribly, and it's really hard to read that storyline, but her writing is impeccable, so it becomes a beautiful read even though it's tough subject matter. There's quite a bit of drug use in this book, so there's a content warning about that. But I think it's just, again, a masterpiece. I think Helen Garner's fiction is just so raw and written from such honest perspectives that it's almost non-fiction. I guess her writing style is kind of a mesh of non-fiction and fiction together, and that's what makes it so unique. So yeah, it's got lots of references to areas that I've lived around Melbourne, so that's another reason why I loved it so much, especially down Fitzroy, Edinburgh Gardens. She actually lived in Fitzroy North when she wrote this book, and that's where I was living for the past 2 years, so it was very nostalgic for me reading that and experiencing it while I was living in that area, especially during the Melbourne heatwave, because she writes about the Melbourne heatwaves really well. So yeah, Monkey Grip, another 5-star read from me. Next up, I have We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This was a beautifully morbid book. It's written from the perspective of Mary Catherine Blackwood, who is an 18-year-old girl who is living in this huge house just on the outskirts of town in the woods. It's quite a dark, scary old house. Everyone in the town is terrified of her and her sister who live in the house, and her uncle, because the rest of the family is dead. You learn that in the first chapter of the book, and it is believed that one of the girls has poisoned the family, and so yeah, everyone in the town thinks that they're murderers and they're very terrified of them, and they try to avoid going into town at all costs. So it's got quite an agoraphobic vibe. It's a horror, I believe, or a thriller, quite a gothic book, and I just enjoyed every sentence of this book. It was so, I absorbed it, you know, I took the time to absorb it and really appreciate her constructing of sentences, but also her character studies of each of these 3 individuals and the other people who come along during the story. And wow, it's just, you know, there's so much to talk about with this book, but I don't want to give anything away, so it's difficult to know how to explain it to you guys as the viewer or as the pre-reader. But I will say that it's probably my favourite classic now after reading this, and I haven't read a huge amount of classics, I must admit, but this is my kind of book because it's morbid, it's complex, it's got a real gloomy, dark vibe, and that's my favourite kind of vibe when I'm reading. And the characters are fascinating, and they're quite funny too, so it's almost like funny morbid. It's interesting. So yeah, another 5-star read from me. Shirley Jackson, We've Always Lived in the Castle. Next up we have The Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood. This was the Stella Prize winner in 2016 in Australia. This book is almost, I've spoken about this before in a few other videos. It's kind of like the Australian Handmaid's Tale, but I also don't want to take away from the amazingness that is this book by saying that, because it is its own story and it is its own idea. There's just a few elements that did remind me heavily of The Handmaid's Tale. It's a story of struggle. Oh, Todd, what are you doing? Sorry, I got distracted there because my dog went through the bin and took all of the food onto her bed. It was very naughty. She doesn't normally do things that naughty, so had to pause, reevaluate the situation, fix it. I'm back. This book was what I was talking about. So basically, to sum it up, it's just a very intense book about survival in Australia. It's set in the outback, in the middle of nowhere. It's about being a woman, and it's about women binding together to, yeah, I can't say too much without giving it away, but it's just fucking phenomenal, this book. So you should really get a hold of it if you haven't read it before. Be warned, it is really intense. There's that word again. No, but it really is intense, brutal. There's some not animal cruelty, I guess it is animal cruelty. There's some animal stuff that happens, and that's probably the toughest thing for me to read. So that was really, really difficult. But I'm glad I didn't know about it beforehand, because I pushed through, I read it anyway, and I still gave it 5 stars. I think it was needed, and I think it was brilliantly written, and it made me feel a lot of things. And yeah, so it was an excellent 5-star read for me, and that's my 4th 5-star read that I've said so far. But yeah, there's a lot of 5-star reads for me this year so far. So yeah, Natural Way of Things, Charlotte Wood. Next up we have The Love of a Bad Man by Laura Elizabeth Willett. This came out last year. I'd been wanting to get a hold of it for quite a while, so I borrowed it from the library. It blew me away. These stories are historical fiction, so they're based on female characters that have been married to or in a relationship with men that are bad throughout history. So there's a bunch of different people written about in here, and it's all historical fiction, and it's fascinating, and I learned a lot, and I did a lot of Wikipedia searching afterwards, and she did an excellent job of, you know, making it as believable as possible. Each character study is really well done and unique, and each story is really different from one another, which I think is excellent. I'm really looking forward to her new book, which is coming out soon. So that was another 5-star from me. Short stories, historical fiction, Love of a Bad Man by Laura Elizabeth Willett. Next up we have The Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krasnostein. This is a non-fiction book about a trans woman who grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and had a very difficult life, experienced a lot of trauma, and then became a trauma cleaner afterwards. So she still works and lives as a trauma cleaner here in Melbourne. Basically, a trauma cleaner, for those who don't know, is cleaning up crime scenes and after suicides and murders, and helping hoarders clear out their houses, which is probably one of the most gruesome things, because there's some pretty foul things in houses of people who haven't cleaned up or moved things around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So this read was very visceral. You can almost smell the smells that Sarah describes in her writing. Just to make it clear, Sarah wrote this biography about someone else, so it's not about herself. It's not an autobiography. It's not a memoir. So Sarah Krasnostein was actually born in America, but this is a book that was written and published in Australia. So yeah, but yeah, this was one of the best books I've read this year. It's one of the first highly rated books I read this year, and I was really excited when I finished it because I thought that's the book of the year for sure, but that did end up changing. This is still very high up there. Definitely rated at 5 stars, but there's another book that will be my number one. You'll see soon. So I have 3 more books to talk about that I don't actually have here with me, and then I have my number one choice of the year so far. So the first one I'll talk about is I Am by Maggie O'Farrell. This is a non-fiction memoir, 17 Brushes with Death. So it's 17 times that Maggie O'Farrell has experienced brushing against death, whether it was herself or someone else close to her that brushed with death. This I listened to on audiobook. I absolutely loved it. I've spoken about it before on this channel, so I won't say too much, but it blew me away. It left me feeling a lot of feelings, and in a good and a bad way. I could relate to a lot of the stories, and I found it fascinating. I think her writing style is brilliant and eloquent and quite gory in places as well, which is also enjoyable for some people. Yeah, this is definitely something I recommend listening to on audio if you can get a copy of that on Audible, because it's actually read by Maggie O'Farrell herself. That was another 5-star from me. Next up we have Salt by Nayyirah Waheed, and this is a poetry collection. So Nayyirah is a woman of colour who writes incredible poetry. I believe Rupi Kaur was probably influenced by her, as she released a few books of poetry before Rupi ever did. And it's a similar style. It's like that short sentences, abrupt sentence style. It doesn't necessarily rhyme, it creates this beautiful flow of words. I will read you one out just so that you have an idea of what it's like. What about this theory? The fear of not being enough and the fear of being too much are exactly the same fear, the fear of being you. So yeah, she writes just impeccable, beautiful poetry. The short phrasings are always packing a punch, so each poem leaves you hanging on every word and almost teary at every poem, because there's just so much emotion in each one, and it shows you the power of words and how simple it can be to make someone feel something, and how you don't need to overdo it, with words, which is what we tend to do, and what has been done throughout history a lot of the time. And sometimes I love that. Sometimes I love the over-descriptive language in some fiction, specifically historical fiction. But then you read a poetry book like this, and it's so short and simple, and it's got so much meaning, and it just makes you realize that simple can be just as potent as complex. The last book that I don't have with me is When I Hit You by Meena Kandasamy. That was one of the shortlisted books for the Bailey's Women's Prize this year. It was an amazing book. It blew me away. It was about a young Indian woman who falls in love with her professor, who is this Marxist type of guy. She finds him very open-minded and exciting, and I think she sees a lot of potential in a growth together in their future. Does that make sense? Sees a lot of potential for growth together in their future. So my camera died. I've had a few complications filming this video. Wanted it to be a quick one, but it turns out it's not my day. So, talking about When I Hit You by Meena Kandasamy. So that was another one of my top books this year. I just thought it was brilliantly written, and I think that the story is something that needs to be told. A lot of people don't have much direct experience with domestic abuse, and I don't think it's spoken about enough in the media, especially in the way that Meena was able to do it. She wrote it in the way that you as the reader are able to follow the abuse cycles very slowly, and it's almost as if you're experiencing it yourself, because it's coming out of nowhere, and it's not coming out of nowhere, sorry, it's so gradual that it feels like when it gets to the extreme abuse towards the end of the book and the middle of the book, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, how did we get here? Like, how did this happen so easily? And I think that just proves that narcissistic abusers are manipulative, and it's not necessarily a red flag at the beginning. You don't think, oh, they've done this thing, they're going to abuse me physically, or they're going to abuse me mentally for the rest of my life. You just think, oh, it's just a little thing, it's fine, it's not a big deal. And these things build up to a point where it reaches, it pushes the boundary really quite intensely, and you're already wrapped in this situation, and it's difficult to get out of. And I think that it's really important to write things like this and put them out into the world so that people can be wary and people can understand that victim blaming is not the way to go, and these people don't choose to be in these situations. Nobody does. It's just a victim of circumstance, if that makes sense. And anyway, it was a brilliant book and I highly recommend it. And last but not least, my top book of the year so far, Eggshell Skull by Bree Lee. A few people commented on my last video saying that it's actually become quite popular on BookTube already, and that makes me so happy because this is something that I want everybody to read. I've recommended it to everyone I know so far. A few of my friends have purchased a copy. My husband's going to read it soon. I've spoken about it a little bit before, but basically it's written from the perspective of the author. It's non-fiction. It's written by Bree Lee. She studied as a lawyer and landed a job as a judge's associate shortly afterwards, and she worked as a judge's associate for a few years. During that time, she did a lot of writing. She documented a lot of things that had happened and that she witnessed in courtrooms around Australia, mostly northern Australia, so Queensland, north east. There is a lot of talk about child abuse in this book, and sexual abuse, sexual assault. And so there's a trigger warning there for that. Well, I'm giving a trigger warning for that. It's very difficult to read some of this, not because of the way she's written it. She's written it so beautifully. She writes almost as well as Helen Garner, in my opinion. I just love her writing style. As someone I know, I think it was Michael, said it was very clear-eyed, and that's pretty much the perfect way to sum up how she's written this. It's very intelligent, but it's also completely clear-eyed. Like, she knows what she's saying and she's saying it, and there's no funny business. There's no messing about with prose and making it complicated, but there's also no uncertainty. She knows what she's writing and she needs to write it, and she's writing it, if that makes sense. As Helen Garner says, a young woman finds her steel and learns to wield it, and it's just the perfect way to sum it up. But yeah, I think that it's just a bit of a shock being an Australian and reading this book and understanding for the first time how much abuse is happening around the country that isn't in the media, that isn't publicised, that is hidden away in courtrooms. And a lot of people are experiencing their abusers getting off not guilty because there's not enough evidence. And things like that are very difficult to stomach, because I can't imagine being in that situation and having that result come of it, going through the trials and the long-winded experience of going to court. And it's not something that you just do once. It takes a very long time to go through the court process, and that's what this book explains as well. So shortly afterwards, she ends up herself going to trial as a victim in... I'm not going to tell you about what she's a victim of, because I don't want to give too much away, but I think you should get a copy of this if you can, and I think you will love it. I think I can say that pretty happily towards everybody, because it's just an excellent book. I am very hungover, so as I'm filming this and talking, I'm realizing that I'm very tired, and it's very difficult to keep going and push myself. My energy is very quickly dropping, so I think I'm going to have to wrap it up here. I hope this video has been enjoyable, because each one of the books that I've spoken about have been really incredible experiences for me this year and have really lightened my year. Well, they're all quite dark books, but they've lightened my year in a way that they've shed some light on subjects that maybe I wasn't as familiar with, or they've opened my eyes to things that I hadn't really noticed were there before, and they've expanded my brain. So I recommend every single one of them, and please let me know if you've read any of them and if they're any of your favourite reads of the year so far, or if you plan on reading them sometime soon. I'd love to talk about it with you. I'm really looking forward to putting up another video soon when I'm not so hungover. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye! Dawn, you just farted and it's gonna be really stinky. Thanks a lot.